Well, good day, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Classic Rock and Prog Almanac with myself, Tim Appleton, all on me Todd. And today we're going to talk about David Bowie, or is it Bowie? I have to say I've always called him David Bowie, but that's not his name, is it? It's David Bowie. I mean, even he himself calls himself David Bowie, so I will try to use Bowie today. There you are, nailed it. Because we don't want a repeat of the Phil Lynott fiasco. But if a Bowie slips in along the way, please forgive me. I thought it'd be good to talk about Bowie. There it is. Because last week was the anniversary of his death, and there's a new documentary out about him, isn't there? So I thought I'd talk about my favourite Bowie album, which is Hunky Dory. Now, what can we say about this album? I think, this is his best album. From my perspective, he does interesting stuff throughout his career. David Bowie. Oh God, but no question. But I think that this album is head and shoulders above all the others. It's head and shoulders, from my perspective, above The Man Who Sold the World, and I think it's better than Ziggy Stardust, Aladdin Sane. This could be debated, I suppose, but I think he had like a spurt. If that's the word, of songwriting just before this album came out. And I think he spent a while kind of living with that quarry of songs that he had come up with. And this album is really the beneficiary of that. I think it's one of those albums that sounds like a greatest hits. You know, it's one of those, even though it's just another album. I would say it's Beatles-ish. In what sense? Well, sort of diversity of styles, I think. Sort of open-hearted, creative spark. Not to mention the arrangements, which sound very Beatlesy. Is it Beatlesy or is it McCartney-esque? That's an interesting question, isn't it? I mean, I think this is Beatlesy, this album, in the sense of it's the most McCartney-esque album. Perhaps we could risk the hypothesis that Ziggy, the album afterwards, is more John, a bit more sort of subjectively authentic, but perhaps less musically ambitious. The other thing I wanted to say about it is amazing words. He's an amazing lyric writer, Bowie, I think. Whatever else you think about him, just sit back and enjoy those words. All right, some Imperial facts, as is our wont. This was recorded in summer 1971 and released at Christmas, produced by Ken Scott and Bowie himself at Trident Studios in London, which was a studio that everybody worked at, from the Beatles and the Stones through Elton John and Queen to Genesis, yes, Van der Graaf Generator, etc. Reached 3 in the UK chart and 57 in the States. I don't know how to interpret that. It's always UK and US, isn't it, with these things? It says here 26 in Denmark. How about that? That's for the Danish listeners. What about the title, Hunky Dory? I think this takes us straight to the heart of the album's thematic, because I think it could be considered a trans title. Let's talk about trans. They used to call it gender bending, didn't they? But I suppose today, formally, we could call it the trans question, because there's a lot of trans issues come up in this album, and I think that it begins with the title, really, because hunky is it's a nonsense piece of speech, right? Hunky Dory, but hunky is a word you would use to describe men, very masculine men, and Dory is a girl's name, right? So I feel like the whole sort of identity shifting thing that Bowie's doing throughout the whole album is present in the title. It's also present, by the way, on the cover, right? Because it's Bowie as female Hollywood starlet, isn't it? Right. And so, I don't know, it's supposed to evoke a movie still, I think. And it also evokes Andy Warhol's Marilyn series, which came out a few years before, in that it's colorized monochrome, basically. That's the technique that they're using. And of course, Warhol's mentioned on the album. So we'll come back to that later on. All right, good. Let's do tracks. Side 1, track 1, Changes. Now, this track is about changes. It opens and closes, by the way, with changing chords, if you remember. Da, da, da. So it moves up a semitone at a time. I think each of these represents, each of these constitutes a new key, basically. So this is a programmatic opening, quite clever, isn't it? Then you've got a sort of coquettish glam riff, right? Very much of the era, or slightly prefiguring the glam era, perhaps you could say. And then it goes into what Bowie himself called, a parody of a nightclub song, right? And then you've got this amazing soaring chorus. There's this big sort of hit type track. This, isn't it? This one, sort of much more poppy and catchy and appealing than anything he'd done before, really. And that's one of the sort of characteristics of this album. As I said, it's sort of its greatest hitsy. Then what? Yeah, and then that whole sequence is repeated. Then you get a middle eight and a final chorus. So the thing is that it seems to go from section to section, this track. And it's, in that sense, it's medley-ish. And it seems to almost have been composed as a gestalt, if you like. And, otherwise it doesn't make sense, really. For example, like the opening riff is in D, but the song's in C. So the riff only works as a prelude to the verse. Otherwise, it's incoherent, essentially. I do wonder how much influence Rick Wakeman had, who was playing the piano, on some of these arrangements and some of these key shifts and things. I don't want to overestimate his role, but he was Mr. Key Change, wasn't he? And he's playing piano on this album. I think the arrangement of this track, Changes, is sort of 60s style, i.e., classical, really. It's not power pop, this. And what I mean by that is you get a sort of, again, a diversity of arrangements within the space of one short song, right? And I think another key point here is the sort of, and it's another classical element, really, is the descending chord sequence of inversions, actually, on the chorus, a la, Pachelbel, Bach, maybe. In fact, the first two tracks have that sort of descending chord sequence, as does All the Young Dudes, which was written at the same time. And then track 4 on this album, Life on Mars, because track 3 is an interlude. So essentially the first 3 major tracks on this album have this sequence, or at least Life on Mars rather does a variation on it, we should say. And again, those 3 tracks, 1, 2, and 4, as it were, are the most sort of epic, famous and catchy songs on the album. It's like he wanted to be remembered with this one. That's the way I feel about it. What are the lyrics doing here? Well, this is autobiographical, isn't it? This track, it's something of a manifesto. It includes references to my generation. The sort of repeated syllables, ch-ch-ch, changes. Sounds a bit like for my generation. Sort of pill-popping mod aesthetic. And it's also, like my generation, contains the admonition not to grow old. So this is not just an injunction to change, this track. I think it's also reflective of a generational war, which will come up on other tracks too on this album. He said, these children that you spit on, he says, and then you get the almost times they are a changing echo of you've left us up to our necks in it. And Dylan, of course, comes up later on this album as well. And then finally, what else? I turned myself to face me. I think that's an important line, because what you got there is a split subject, of course. Split between multiple identities and, of course, everything that isn't multiple identities, i.e. subjectivity as such. So it's an ontological, it's a Cartesian argument there. Right. So it's a very interesting track, this one. A catchy Cartesian disquisition, if you like. Track 2, Oh You Pretty Things. This starts with sort of Rick Wakeman-esque chordal experimentation. Again, was it him playing the piano or David? This is disputed. David, I'm saying David, so I don't have to say Bowie. Maybe David Bowie wasn't very good at the piano, I don't know, so they got Rick in to finish it off. Anyway, once again, this track, Oh You Pretty Things, changes key over and over again before finally settling on C sharp. But is it C sharp major or C sharp minor? It alternates, is the truth. A bit like how Bowie alternates gender and alternates between different identities in the space of within all of these songs and within this album. So I think there's again a link here with the lyrics, right? This time you got a Beatlesy chorus, but and it's swung, but it's got half-time drums, right? And this again, I think, is a style basically established by the Beatles. So it's reminiscent of Martha, My Dear, or Lady Madonna, for example. So we mentioned Paul before. We've got Ringo now. And we mentioned Paul and John. Now we've got Ringo. Almost completed the set. Let's see if we can get George in at some point. I wondered here whether Slade, actually, the band Slade, might be considered the missing link here between the Beatles, glam, and Bowie. Yes. Because they also covered Martha, My Dear, if you remember. Now, this song is a more simple structure, sort of like verse sequence, chorus, and that's basically it. And if I may, I think a song can't have such a simple structure and not be good, basically, or bad, But this one's in the good category, because it's got to work with such a simple structure. And it reminds me, actually, curiously enough, of Some Might Say by Oasis, which has a very similar structure. That's such a great song, and the reason why it's great, it's great because it's such a simple structure. Anyway, we also have another soaring chorus here, with, as I said, with the epic descending diatonic run downwards. And another Beatles aspect here is that when they get to the end of that downwards chordal run, and it gets to the fourth chord, it contains a flattened seventh, which is the third of the scale. So that's incongruous with the major key that the song's in. So that's interesting, and it's incongruous but very logical, which is what you want, isn't it, from your art? And the vocal line follows it. So yeah, that's great. And what about the lyrics here? Well, I think this is like, it could be considered a gay pride anthem, right? Because Oh You Pretty Things is not gendered, right? But really, I think this is another song about youth. The youth shall inherit the earth, to paraphrase, Book of Matthew. So he says, don't you know you're driving your mamas and papas insane? Nice reference to the mamas and papas there. You're driving your mamas and papas insane, possibly with the help of some visiting aliens. Bowie's obsessed with aliens. Right? He talks about it on the Ziggy Stardust video. And I think this track lyrically starts in a sort of ominous way, a bit like War of the Worlds, suddenly, unbeknownst to the humans, the aliens drop in. But I think the main thing here to mention in these lyrics is the reference to Nietzsche, because this comes up again and again on the album. He talks about the Homo superior, which of course is Nietzsche's Übermensch, right? The Superman. So actually the references to the Superman on this album are constant, right? And I think this is important. Why? Because it relates to, again, the sort of the trans issue and the injunction to change, right? And the reason why is because, basically Nietzsche thought that all meaning was rhetorical, i.e. contingent, right? So constructed, which is an idea that today we associate with postmodernism, of course, which was just getting big when Bowie made this album. But this is also compatible, I think, with the theory of the Superman, because the Superman is essentially somebody who embraces this contingency, right? And, this is Bowie, isn't it? Bowie. Bloody hell. So here we have Bowie as Superman, as it were. Track 3, 8-line poem. A little interlude, really, this. Not much to say about it. It's a sort of coda to Oh You Pretty Things. I think the only thing perhaps we could say about it that's of interest to thematically is that the vocalizations here are so varying. It's like he's playing around with identity. So again, very postmodern, kind of multiplicity. in the Deleuzian sense, let's say. And he seems to be taking a trip here to the US. He talks about cacti and there's a country guitar in the background, right? The poem itself could be about anything, really. I mean, the only possible connotation I can think of is, funnily enough, is psychosexual, which might fit with the rest of the album's themes. In other words, in this track, like according to the lyrics, the sun is penetrating everything, like the father in Freud's discussion of the Judge Schraber case. So, in other words, there's a homosexual desire on display here, or being sketched out. Anyway, let's go to Life on Mars, track 4. This is another big, epic, catchy number. I mean, I think this is one of the greatest pop songs ever written. The first 2 tracks on this album, Changes and Oh You Pretty Things, are epically classic pop songs. But this one goes even further, I think. First of all, you've got this verse, which is a parody of My Way, right? I suppose people know this story, but Bowie wrote the original English translation of My Way, or whatever that was called in French, right? For use by Frank Sinatra, I think, or maybe that wasn't confirmed yet, I don't know. But apparently they were rejected, which is hilarious, because as I've already pointed out, he's one of the greatest lyricists Britain's ever produced. But apparently he was hurt by this, and wanted to do his own version. So the verses ape the chords of My Way, if you'll notice. But he's doing a very existential lyric over the top about a lost little girl. So it couldn't be further from the theme of My Way. And then he develops the harmony, and of course the melody too, in a completely uproarious way in the bridge, almost as if he's trying to subvert the, I have to say, slightly shit harmony of My Way, from my perspective. So in other words, this track is in F major, and then he modulates several times in the bridge. It's really complicated chords, this, before landing on A sharp for the chorus. So there's no key relation at all, really. So this is pure writing, pure harmonic writing here. I think it's the most sophisticated chordal writing you can imagine, really, in a pop song. Again, don't know if this is Rick Wakeman's influence slightly. Maybe that's unfair. And then, again, we have another soaring chorus. And then finally, there's sort of post-chorus detritus, some guitar licks, which sound almost like a musical, I think. I think this track sounds a little bit like Queen, actually, Avant la lettre. I don't know if he would have been happy with that comparison, Bowie, although he did the song with Queen, of course, later on. Again, the arrangement here is somewhat Beatlesy. I think the cello parts are reminiscent of sort of George Martin's arrangements, particularly in I Am the Walrus, things like that. Is this unsingable, this track? I mean, the final note, Mars, is a life on Mars, is so high. And when I first saw the Ziggy film as a kid, I thought, it's weird that he didn't do that song. And then I thought later on, well, maybe it's because it's just unsingable, because it's too high. And the other day, on the new documentary, actually, I saw the Glastonbury footage, like when he did the triumphant return to Glastonbury in the new millennium. And he started, I think more or less started with Life on Mars, and he sang that note, and I thought, oh my God, he's sung it. But actually, I grabbed the guitar and I checked it, and it's actually, he was singing it a fourth below the original version. So that was a nice little sleight of hand there. The lyrics here are extremely moving, I find. What I find interesting about this is that this is a cut-up lyric. Later on, he became famous for doing cut-ups, which was influenced by William Burroughs, the American writer, and where he would take bits of like different lines, and like cut them up and mix them around and things, and then see what he came up with. It's a sort of aleatory technique, right? He's not quite doing that yet on this album, but the whole line, lyrical line ending on Life on Mars of this track, I mean, it does end on a magnificent non sequitur, you have to say. So in a sense, it prefigures the cut-up technique. The non sequitur is their life on Mars, which seems to have nothing to do with the rest of the track, because this is about a girl that's had a troubled childhood, apparently, who escapes into a fantasy realm of cinema but finds it boring. So ends up wondering whether there's any life anywhere, and then says perhaps on Mars, right? So it's sort of, anyway, I mean, it's brilliant, this in sort of evocative kind of economy, but also interesting from the cut up angle. Okay, good. Track 5, Kooks. This is a different style, this one. Jazzy. Again, a multiplicity in full effect here, multiple styles. This is also the first song without any non sequiturs whatsoever, right? That's to say it's about something consistent. It's a very sweet lyric, actually. It's about his son, Duncan, who later became a famous film director, people may know, directed Moon, which I think won an Oscar for something. Probably, costume or something. But it was a really good film, that one. And yes, so it's funny and charming lyric, has great lines. Don't pick fights with the bullies or the cads because I'm not much cop at punching other people's dads, he sings. But yeah, it's about sort of being inducted into a club of joyful freaks, namely David and Angie Bowie. This is a less epic song than the first three, musically speaking. What it does, having the three main ones, changes, Are You Pretty Things and Life on Mars. I think what it does have in common with those tracks is that the harmony is pretty original. I mean, it modulates more than once, this track, in a very short space of time. And the melody itself has several notes that don't fit into the chords, so that's cool, interesting. Just slightly less memorable, I think, than those first three iconic tracks. But yeah, the words make this one a lot of fun, really. Perhaps we should also mention the voicings, again, in the name of multiplicity. I mean, once again, here Bowie's literally being different people, right? He's shifting between identities, again, the trans question. Specifically, he's being American in the chorus and English in the verses here, during which he seems to be describing a typical English grammar school. So it's like a little playlet, an English grammar school playlet, and he's playing characters again. All right, good. Let's go to the final track on side one, which is Quicksand. Now, this is more reminiscent, this track, of Bowie's earlier stuff, I think. It's more moody, dark, metaphysical, bit sort of goes on a bit longer, Now, this is a guitar-y track, a bit like Kooks, actually. By this point in the album, we've moved slightly away from the piano tracks and we're into the guitar-y stuff. It's interesting that, like, all the really famous tracks on this album at the beginning are piano-based. And when he gets into the guitar stuff, we get into a little bit more of a complex area, thematically and in terms of mood. But yeah, we're definitely there by this point. I read that the producer, Ken Scott, was apparently trying to get a sort of George Harrison sound. Hey, here we are, George Harrison, full house. Mentioned all the Beatles now. You might think, why a George Harrison sound? Well, Ken Scott, I think, produced or helped to produce All Things Must Pass, which was a hit album, I guess, right? So I think, related to the question about piano or guitar, the chordage, so to speak, is more original as well on the piano ones. And so the chordage on this track, Quicksand, is a little bit more conventional, although it does go piano-ish, let's say, in that sense, on the final chorus. Don't believe in yourself, don't believe... Because it's got sort of like diminished chords in there and stuff. And some... and a key change, I think, if I'm not misremembering in there, which from a guitarist perspective seems quite mad, right? But... again, he's trying new things here, isn't he, Bowie? He's trying to... I mean, when we were talking earlier about embracing contingency, one thing that you can be thinking about, if it's contingency in the sort of like sense of the Deleuzean multiplicity, what you have is a sort of twisting of elements, right? So he's twisting the harmony in a lot of these tracks, and he does it here as well. So, there's a sort of logic to it, but it's a kind of mad logic, and it's very interesting to listen to. Lyrically, we've got some more Nietzsche stuff on this track. He sings, "I'm not a prophet or a Stone Age man, just a mortal with potential of a Superman. I'm living on. I'm tethered to the logic of Homo sapien." So, in other words, we've got more stuff here about being the Superman, right? Now, here he mixes it actually with Nazi references and satanic references. Aleister Crowley, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, etc. Plus some anti-Churchill stuff. That's to say anti-fascist stuff. So I think it's safe to say that he's playing with the dark side of this Nietzschean logic here. I mean, a few years later he got in trouble, didn't he, for flirting with fascism by saying things like Adolf Hitler was the first rock star or something like that. But later, or after that, looking back on it, apparently he said that he was just on drugs. So that was his excuse for saying that. But yeah, I think in any case, a lot of this has to do with whether you think the Nazis misread Nietzsche, which I think is incontestable that they did. But anyway, that's a conversation for another day. Side 2, Fill Your Heart. Right. This is another sort of show number, as it were. Could be designed here as a breather, I think, between Quicksand, which is quite a metaphysically heavy track, and some of the more existential parts of the album that are about to come up, which you can tell they're existential because they're, as I said earlier on, they're guitar-y tracks, so they're more introverted. Because the guitar, in a sense, I think, is a more introverted instrument than the piano, right? Which you have to play with your head up. The guitar, you play with your head down, right? So it kind of lends itself to a kind of more, reflective attitude. Reflexive and reflective. I think it makes sense that this would be a deliberate choice to put this track here. Perhaps, as I said, a deliberate choice of breather, because it's almost a found object, this track. It's identical to the Biff Rose original, down to the vocalization. Almost as if he's heard the track and thought, right, that's what I need at the beginning of side 2 of my album. Can't copy it exactly, so I'm going to have to recreate it, but like almost note by note. And I think this is borne out by the fact that it should have been Bombers, which was an outtake from this album, and apparently that was replaced at the last minute with this track, Fill Your Heart, right? Bombers is a wonderful, slightly experimental Bowie track, but again, it's slightly less light-hearted, all said and done, than this one. And so I think this was probably a deliberate choice. Now, let's go on to track 2, side 2, which is Andy Warhol. We're really in the bowels of the album now. This track starts with 2 quite disturbing, almost endless dodecaphonic sequences overlaid one on top of another, plus a slightly tense exchange between Bowie and his producer, which is treated for effect, and then punctuated by uproarious laughter. This is quite sort of situationist, I would say, which I guess is supposed to sort of invoke the quasi-situationism of Andy Warhol's art, Again, sort of embracing the contingency of the medium and the moment, right? Opens with a big riff, this one. For again, 'tis an entirely guitar-y number, this one. This riff, of course, was later cadged by Metallica for Master of Puppets. Metallica fans take note. Now again, you can tell this is composed on guitar because the chords are more conventional in some ways than some of the previous tracks. Plus it's in E minor, which is the key for guitarists. Once again, however, I think he does try to subvert the line, does try to subvert the flow of the track, particularly harmonically. Well, harmonically, but the first thing he does is he adds a beat to one of the bars in the verse, so it's like 4/4/5, right? Which is kind of again uncanny, sets it off a bit. And then you'll notice that in the chorus, the chords don't fit the melody, almost as if he's trying to subvert the melody line with the harmony. And those sort of like offset chords, as it were, played quite frenetically, paranoidically, if you like. Going back to the Deleuze issue, Deleuzianism. And then right at the end, he plays chromatic chords around the root notes, which sounds extra paranoid to me. Now, I think the very sound and arrangement and form of this track reminds you that the writing on this album is so versatile. How versatile this album is, right? It's so much color on the record, and this track doesn't sound like any of the others. The unity, of course, being Bowie's bloody hell, artistry. Once again, Bowie as Superman. Here he speaks from the perspective of Warhol, first person, I think. And remember, he played Warhol in a film later on. And I think Warhol is the perfect model for him. That's why we said earlier that the cover is Warhol-esque. And the reason why is, I think, because Warhol is like the archetypal postmodern artist, isn't he? Multiplying references, almost accelerationistically, and always circling the void of personality, as in Bridget Jones's Singletons, right? Singleton, the empty set, the void. So yeah, it's all here. All of the key artistic references are present on this track. Okay, let's move on to track 3, side 2, song for Bob Dylan. Got a new persona again here. Now he's playing Bob Dylan. This song is written in a country-ish, Dylan-esque style, right? And Bowie's copying his vocalizations. And again, of course, Dylan, like Bowie, is a multiplier. Even his name is split, isn't it? Dylan Zimmerman. So I suppose in a sense we can say that Dylan is also Superman for Bowie as well, because Bowie calls him a super brain in the song, which is another Nietzschean reference, right? Bowie definitely identified with Dylan because he later said apparently that he was fascinated by how Dylan used rock and roll, which is an interesting phrase, and he said that he wanted to do the same, right? Again, he wanted to sort of twist things, right? And he obviously identifies with Dylan, identifying with Woody Guthrie, because this song's title and its opening line are reference to Dylan's song for Woody off his first album, right? So he's not only identifying with Dylan, but he's identifying with Dylan qua multiplier, right? Qua Superman. So I think that's quite cool. I often wonder who the lady is in this song. Here she comes, he sings in the chorus. The painted lady that Dylan's apparently invented, that also needs to be kept at bay. I don't know what this metaphor means. Does she represent social chaos, or is she, as it were, the vaguely threatening woman that populates quite a few Bob Dylan songs? I used to think maybe it was Dylan himself that Bowie was referring to, which is another sort of trans theme, I suppose. But now I'm not so sure. Anyway, answers on a postcard, please. Track 4, side 2 is Queen Bitch. Right. One last big hit before the album's done, I think, this one. We've got Changes, Oh You Pretty Things, Life on Mars, big sort of like singly, poppy, epic, catchy openings to the album. And then before we go completely existential in the final track, we've got one last sort of pop rock hit, catchy hit here. It's sort of glammy, this one, very exciting, a lot of fun. Earlier I said that Quicksand at the end of side 1 sort of seems to point backwards to some of his earlier work. This track, I think, points forward, perhaps to Ziggy. The sound arrangements are the same, and mood, are the same on this track as they are on almost every single track on Ziggy, which is the following album, right? And I think perhaps, again, this is why I prefer this album, much more versatile. As I said earlier, more McCartney-esque, right? But we could debate all of that, I suppose. And this track, of course, famously also reflects the Velvet Underground, Lou Reed influence, sound, writing style, and the words, of course. Because, again, it's gender bending, in inverted commas, which was an issue that Lou Reed, played around with a lot. And the lyrics here seem to be about a man competing with prostitutes, possibly trans ones, something like that. So it's all of a piece. One of the things I like about this track is that it's entirely through composed. If you notice, each section emerges organically out of the previous one, right? So even though it comes off as a basic rock and roll track, it's actually slightly classical in structure. And of course, it's a story, as I mentioned earlier. So the structure feels programmatic in that sense, like it's moving the story along. Okay, let's go to the final track, Bewley Brothers, which, as I've already trailed, is another existential number. It's a bit like Quicksand in a way. It's a good side ender. A bit more proggy, a bit longer, more involved. It's got a mad ending as well. We'll come back to that in a sec. This song seems to be about David Bowie's relationship with his brother, who was apparently schizophrenic and institutionalized, I think. Now, whether schizophrenia is an organic illness or not may be undecidable, when it comes to the question of the etiology of illnesses, or the etiology of complexes. But, I think the paranoia about this question and even the attraction of the schizoid position might inform the lyric here. Partly, I think that because the words overrun the melodies and barely rhyme. So again, this makes sense as a reference to the schizoid position. There I'm alluding to Deleuze and Guattari. Because it's supposed to be an operation on discourse, as it were, making it overrun its normal boundaries, as James Joyce famously does in Ulysses, which is often interpreted as a schizoid text, right? Now, and again, like in Andy Warhol, because there seems to be a parallel here, in some ways, the guitar collapses into chromaticism at the end, culminating in a repeated B minor F sequence, which of course represents the famous Diabolus in Musica, the devil in music, because if you play it straight, it's supposed to sound like the most uncanny interval imaginable, right? Maybe that's another Aleister Crowley moment, you could say. Which perhaps again represents Bowie's ambivalence about his own creative side. And this sequence, musical sequence at the end, is covered with a slightly chromatic and therefore equally uncanny tune, almost like a nursery rhyme that's electronically treated for weirdness, a bit like again the beginning of Andy Warhol, which I think evokes the sort of the children's game, as it were. The Freudian laboratory that is a child's playroom, right? You just think about the beginning of what's it called? Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Could be the child's playroom that's shared by Bowie and his later institutionalized brother Terry, perhaps. And he's also singing at this point in the Cockney accent, which again might point to his roots. In other words, this album ends, as I say, in chaos. The chaos, perhaps, that is the condition of the multiplicity of instances and identities that Bowie attempts to occupy and reoccupy, thus becoming, as we've already said, Nietzsche's Superman. Okay, and on that bombshell, I'll leave you. Thanks very much for your attention, and I'll see you on the next edition of Crapper, which should be coming up next week. Ta-ra!